Well, it's not good old Redwall oatmeal, but I guess it'll have to do. Cheers. Merry Mousemas. Alright, welcome to the first day of Mousemas, which is the thing that used to be Dresdmas last year. By which I mean, for the next 13 days of Mousemas, I will read and talk about one Redwall book by Brian Jacques per day. And we'll start today with, well, Redwall, because we're doing this in publication order. And I'll try to talk about interesting and cool things. I'll give you a quick synopsis of each book, and then we'll talk about the things that I liked and the things that I did not like. And there are certainly some things that may have aged somewhat poorly, but I expect this to be somewhat more lighthearted and less frustrating than last year's version of this. But, you know, we'll find out by Epiphany, which is, of course, the 6th of January for you heathens out there. With all that said, let's get started and talk about Redwall. Well, Redwall is a novel from 1986 by Brian Jacques. It is about an abbey, that being Redwall Abbey, full of different animals that is attacked by a horde of pirates led by Clooney the Scourge, who's a rat, and the defense of said abbey and how they can do this through appealing to old legends and the very liberal use of all kinds of medieval violence and siegecraft. It's really cool and interesting and funny in that regard. It is, of course, a children's book, but it does not stint the graphic violence. I'll just say that up front. I think you should read this at one point. You should also, or could probably, watch the cartoon series, which is available on YouTube if you want to watch it right now. Anyway, let's go about this. And before we move further, I am currently using the audiobooks. There are unabridged audiobooks for all of them. For some of them, there exist versions which are narrated by Brian Jacques, who is a brilliant narrator, and we'll talk about Jacques at some point during the series. He's a brilliant narrator, and yeah, they're incredibly fun to listen to, even for a very angry old white man like me. So yeah, this is Redwall, the defense of Redwall Abbey against the hordes of Clooney the Scourge. And young Matthias, who becomes a warrior to defend his abbey. Now, let's, go from there and talk about details. How do you think about that? Alright, so the first part that I want to talk about is, in fact, sort of the elephant in the room, which is, are they humans? No, they're not humans. Size and so forth may be somewhat wonky. I don't think that matters much, because this is not a story about, accurate world building or anything of the sorts. If you're looking for hard magic and, strict world building, this is not your series. I don't think that matters, because it is a children's book, and children's logic is somewhat different from Brandon Sanderson Reddit logic, and the requirements for consistency are different. Nevertheless, there is something interesting here when it comes to real-world connections and so forth. These usually are more in, the research or the knowledge of medieval siegecraft, stuff like that, and of course, sometimes names. See, the hero, Martin the Warrior, if you are an expert of, say, Catholic saints, you may know of Martin of Tours, who is, the guy that us people in Europe sometimes celebrate on the 11th of November. He's a Saint Martin, who was a Roman soldier, warrior in a lot of ways, who then became a aesthete, and I'm using the wrong word here, but my point is he became an ascetic. Really bad at this. I am not Asmodeus, is what I'm saying. Martin, being, famous for his warrior and then monk behavior, which is, Martin the Warrior being somewhat of a patron saint of Redwall Abbey, kind of fits that specific thing. Another one is, of course, Clooney the Scourge, and we'll talk about Clooney in a long detail later, but I don't know if you're aware of the name Clooney. Clooney being an important, if not the biggest and most powerful abbey in, parts of medieval Christendom during, the 12th and so forth century. It's situated in France. It is connected with, the starting of certain crusades and all of that. So having your evil rat named Clooney does certainly have these kind of connections. This is obviously one of the things where you can see sort of, hints and nods towards real medieval history and so forth. And I think they add a fun dimension for those of us who have unfortunately spent way too much time reading medieval history. I just wanted to bring those up because they add, I feel, a dimension to the medieval siegecraft elements that will come up when we talk about the violence, showing that Jacques does have a rough idea of where he's going. The next thing here that I feel is important is to quickly address the religion question, because Redwall is an abbey. But it's not a Christian abbey. See, there is no religion in this book, which I think is a clever way of doing this. There are enough Christian or otherwise religious children's books. This one focuses in the Abbey on what you might call culturally Christian, or in a way, culturally medieval. See, abbeys, monasteries are key buildings of our image of the Middle Ages in a lot of ways. And most of us don't necessarily think too hard about the actual sort of underlying theology, dogmas, and so forth that are kind of necessary if you are a monk in a monastery. But, think about the buildings, people in habits walking around, tending gardens, brewing beer, all the things that people tend to do in monasteries. And what Jacques does is he takes all of those elements, the idea of being, hospitable to other people, being, these cultural elements of Christianity, and especially of a monastic Christianity, and kicks out all the God aspect and turns it just into camaraderie, social connections, friendship, brotherhood, and hospitality and charity. And I think that's a clever thing to do with especially a children's book, because these are, universal values that don't need to be tied to Jesus or God or any other religious figure, because, being nice to each other is generally a good idea. I do highly approve of that, which, I think is one important element to mention here, that while this is an abbey and it uses a lot of, monastic terms, mice are wearing habits, there is John Church Mouse and so forth, these are somewhat de-Christianized, and that's something I wanted to bring up in the beginning. We will, develop on all of these themes throughout the next upcoming books. I'm very sure of this. The next thing that I feel is interesting before we move further into detail is the Britishness of it all. See, these books are very British in a lot of ways, and there's a tendency in English language children's literature in particular, but not only children's literature, to have certain elements of Britishness that kind of come from, running a global empire for a couple of centuries, and thus having a massive impact not only on the lives of all those people you colonized, but also on the cultural production during that time. Which means there are elements of, British culture, British army culture, all of these things that we are all aware of if we read any form of English language literature, because they have been pounded into large swaths of the planet for a long time. And they still work for us, right? We have characters like Basil Staghair and Captain Snow and the Squire Julian the cat, and we have all of these creatures being very much caricatures or poking fun at specific parts of the British military, the somewhat lower nobility, higher ranks of of officers in the British military. And that's something you can see in much more gruesome detail in, say, George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman, but those kind of characters show up again and again because they are such a part of a cultural understanding, even though by the time Jacques wrote these books in the 80s and 90s, that stuff was sort of past. It's the same kind of thing you see in, say, J.R. Tolkien's books when he talks about the hobbits and the relationship between, say, Frodo and Sam being very much inspired by the relationship between an officer and their Batman, which has sadly nothing to do with bats, although it would be really cool if Jacques uses the Batman joke in his books. We'll find out. So once again, there are elements in here that require the audience to have this understanding of cultural Britishness in a way that may be lost on some by now. But, the jokes are still in there. Basil Staghair is still a very interesting and funny character, even if you don't get the whole context about people constantly bragging about their military service and pretending to be upper class while also being very much reliant on getting as much food and everything else as getting everything out of, pretending to be incredibly military and so forth. That those aspects still work even if you don't get the sort of like cultural context. But I think it's important to understand that that context is there, which then brings me to the broader element of, medieval ideas and other real world ideas that are sort of dragged into this book, because while it is officially all about talking animals killing each other in interesting ways, it does bring in a lot of ideas from our world in other parts as well, right? Say, let's take Clooney and Clooney's Horde, and we'll come back to Clooney as a character in a moment, but the way the Horde is portrayed is very much inspired by the general image of pirates, that being pirates mostly in the Caribbean and so forth, in the golden age of piracy. The idea that the way their booty is divided up depending on having equal shares, but officers getting more shares, and thus rats in under Clooney trying to angle for different positions and so forth. All of these elements are very much tied to what you might call either public history or like popular history or urban legend, or where those things kind of intersect when it comes especially to topics like pirates and so forth, that Jacques builds upon and just replaces people with mice or rats or stoats or ferrets. And the same thing is what we see with the siege and building ballistas and building catapults and building siege towers and digging tunnels and so forth. These elements are very accurate, the same way that, say, the building of the church is in that regard accurate. There's a wonderful passage that I think really brings that home. That is when Matthias and his then friend Warbeak the Sparrow, which brilliant names, all of those names are so fucking fantastic, are climbing up to the Sparrow's kingdom on the roof of the abbey, right? And they have to climb up through underneath the roof of that church, that vaulted church basically, and having these small hallways and stairs and climbing up there. And if you've ever been in the roof cavern of a medieval cathedral, and there are some in Europe where you can do this, right? I was, for example, in the one in Kutnahora. You can climb up through one of the pillars, and you can walk across the roof between the big, massive roof beams and everything. And Jacques gets it. I mean, obviously, he was British, and you have a lot of these kind of buildings in medieval Europe, but he gets those elements very, very, very accurately in a book that is about a mouse and a sparrow climbing up to find a sword, right? So this is what I find interesting about the book, how these weird, or not weird, but interesting minutiae of medieval architecture, medieval siegecraft, pirate organization, how all of these elements kinda are dropped into, a children's book, and you can learn from Redwall, is what I'm saying. And you may actually learn some accurate facts in that regard. I think that is just really interesting to me as someone who thinks about how to portray, say, both history and other forms of, other facts in fantasy on the one hand, and how to make those things interesting. I just appreciated that a lot. So let's move on and talk about the next important part, and that is values, messages, and so forth, because this is a children's book. It is for children, and while I may be a child at heart, I'm obviously only able to look at it back and wishing that I had that when I was a kid, which I wish. The messaging is mostly very, very wholesome in that it, has the usual ideas of Matthias being a young protagonist, being, a bit awkward, stumbling over his own large sandals and so forth, dreaming of being a big hero and trying to find his way there, and then, meeting friends along the way that help him, overcoming more and more sort of challenges to finally be that massive hero and be, Matthias the hero who replaces Martin the hero. And this, I think, is something we'll find out more about throughout the series, and that is how our idols, how role models are important. we start with Matthias learning about Martin from that tapestry and how the image of Martin the warrior and the sword of Martin the warrior are important in that regard. But we also learn in a way that Matthias taking on the role of Martin through the prophecy and then bringing back the sword and everything, how Matthias does in fact become sort of the role model for the next generation of, mice. I mean, that I think is a really interesting concept and almost like a metafictional level, because that's what we do when we write these kind of stories. We create role models, we create idols, we create paths or understandings of who we can be while consuming these texts. And that's particularly strong for, once again, children. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of kids who read this book and want to be Matthias afterwards, or can see themselves in Matthias in that regard. That's really interesting. There are positive and negative sides to all of this, of course. I mean, once again, friendship playing a huge role, having, plot lines that are all about like forgiving each other, past slights, those kind of things. We learn that ruling just through fear is obviously worse than ruling through consent, which, nice one. And all of that, I think, works really well with Redwall, and is up to a point standard fare for any form of children's book. But I want to, slightly move beyond that, because every children's book, while having those standard storylines, does also have things that kind of move beyond that in different ways, in different directions, I guess. And I want to focus more on those, because I think Redwall stands out in that regard. And those are obviously death and violence on the one hand, and some things like gender roles, maybe, and some other bits and pieces. And then we talk about the one or two things that have not aged well. Let's start with death and violence. See, this book is violent as fuck, to put it mildly. We start out with Clooney's first entrance, and he's riding the horse cart, and his first hench rat, Skullface, I think it is crushed by the rim of the wagon wheel, and Clooney yelling at him, "Tell the devil Clooney sent you." This is a top tier villain shit, right? Like, this is incredibly good. But also, we already learned that death happens in these books, and it is often very violent. We have a lot of these situations, some of them well deserved, where we have situations like people getting their just desserts, falling from walls that they have tried to climb in because they trying to steal something, all of those elements. But we also have, and I think this is where the book shines for me as being unique, we have a lot of unnecessary random death, right? The death of Methuselah the mouse, while being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being knocked in the head by Chicken Hound the fox, who's just trying to run away as a thief and being killed accidentally there. That's not necessarily the kind of cause and effect kind of thing where every sort of consequence needs to have something that happened before that makes sense. No, Methuselah is just at the wrong place in the wrong time. The same way that Skullface just falls off the horse accidentally and is killed, because Clooney doesn't care about the fate of his people, and he kills some of them just to prove a point. But even if you are nominally on the good side, accidents can happen, shit happens, and death doesn't have to make sense. Same for Gauzim, the shrew who just falls down into a hole, gets killed by Asmodeus. That's brutal, and doesn't necessarily make sense or have a reason. So having death constant in these books, I think, makes Redwall stand apart. There is obviously more elements to this. Now, let's talk about the violence in the books. And, these are children's books, aged, 7 to 12, 13, 14, whatever. And when it comes to the medieval siege, it gets gnarly in all kinds of ways. As I said, they build a ballista and just spear poor Cheese Teeth with a ballista bolt, and they burn down the siege tower with lamp oil and setting it on fire. And once they dig the tunnel, they put 2 cauldrons of boiling water in the tunnel, basically killing every rat, stoat, and ferret in there. And yes, those are supposed to be the invaders and evil, but it is still pretty fucking gruesome to see all these animals killed in fascinating ways, which makes sense, because obviously violence is, graphic and brutal. And not pointing out how it is all of that, I think, would be, well, dishonest in a way. And I'm talking about this sort of in the context of, essays like Epic Pooh and the idea that there is a way to sort of sugarcoat children's books and not take children seriously. And I think there are some elements of this in Redwall where things are simplified for children, but it does not shy away from these sort of darker truths. And I think this is what makes Redwall work in a way that some other books don't necessarily do, some other stories don't necessarily do. So I wanted to point out that specific part. The next interesting one is, I think, gender roles, because there are some, but the book is surprisingly, positive about this, surprisingly progressive in that there are a lot of female animals having, very male roles, that being Warbeak the Sparrow, being Queen of the Sparrow, becoming Queen of the Sparrows, and Constance the Badger being one of the fiercest warriors in Redwall. So when it comes to these kind of things, the strict sort of gender roles is often very much blurred. At its core, we do still have a very clear, obviously, the romance between, or romance between Cornflower, the mouse girl, and Matthias, the mouse boy, falling in love. But, not every children's book has to be queer. I settle for having a lot of fierce women warriors, and most of the Guerrilla Union of Shrews and Mossflower, which is once again one of those absolutely brilliant ideas, are women. And I'm like, yeah, that's really cool. Having a group of women guerrillas is something that more children's books need. I mean, the Guerrilla Union of Shrews is just generally a absolutely brilliant joke that works for kids, and I think it also works very well for adults. Having, a group of otters being, archers, or in this case also slingshot users, and those are women. Not already pushing sort of those specific gender roles on kids, I think, is a very, very cool idea, and I do really enjoy and appreciate that. So, which parts do we still need to talk about? We need to talk about the cool characters, and then we need to talk about the final sort of bit of not so good. The characters work really well. I think, Matthias being the sort of bumbling, dreamy acolyte or young monk, trying to become a friar and then realizing that he has to become a warrior. I think that's a standard children's sort of archetype going through what you might call a hero's journey, and I'm fine with it in this case. That I think is really cool. Having more wise characters like Methuselah. A lot of these are obviously somewhat archetypal in a lot of ways, but once again, this is a children's book, so this makes sense. What I find interesting is when they slightly diverge from that. For example, with, say, the squirrels, where it's clearly Mother Squirrel Jess who is the active worker, the active warrior one that does all the cool shit. That's interesting. Having young Silent Sam be, not obviously having a disability. We'll talk about disability and stuff in the upcoming books, because there's something very interesting here with Brian Jacques and these books. Having a character who does not talk and only turns talking later on, or long beyond when people think he should be starting talking. Those are interesting to me. Having sort of characters within the even the army of the evil people, the rats and so forth, show different sort of elements of character, having nuance to their character beyond just being evil, I think is interesting. And that's where we need to talk about Clooney the Scourge, because Clooney is just absolutely fucking brilliant in so many ways. He is a rat. He's a pirate. Rat, I guess. He does have an eye patch. He's evil. He's incredibly smart. He has his long tail, the Scourge, which has a poisoned war spike at the end. I mean, that's just wow. And what I find interesting is that he is very much that pirate leader, that horde leader in one way, but we can also see, the dreams sort of pursuing him when he dreams of Martin the Warrior and becomes somewhat unhinged, and the way he uses tactics and uses these elements, I think, is really interesting, because it's easy to have a mad evil villain in a lot of ways, but have them also be really smart and taking mishaps and turning them around, I think, is brilliantly done with Clooney. Plus, he always reminds me of like a heavy metal singer in a lot of ways. It's like several scenes where he addresses his hordes, and I just love the fact when he's like standing on the wall on a tombstone and addressing his hordes and tell them where are we going, and they're Redwall, Redwall, Redwall. What do we do? Kill, kill, kill. It's like, yeah, he's gonna ask for a circle pit any minute now, and I love that. It's really cool. But as I said, the way he does adapt to adversity, to things happening, the way he also tries to work with symbols, stealing the tapestry of Martin the Warrior, using it as propaganda and as his war standard, then back again how they steal those symbols. There's nuance here that is interesting, how they are basically waging like a psychological warfare at the same time as, you know, sneak attacks and all of these other elements. I think that is just very interesting. It makes Clooney more than just a mad villain, but also just a really brilliant villain in that regard. And the way he plays his different underlings against him. And yes, there's slapstick there. I mean, it's a children's book. You need to have some dumb villains falling over their own feet from time to time. But even those do have like ideas and thoughts. And I mean, that's the brilliance, I guess, of writing a children's story in, you know, omniscient, third-person omniscient way. You can give even those different people that from the outside are sort of bumbling idiots, to give them like thought processes of where they are going, what they're doing. I think that is, once again, really, really well done, and I love that. Now let's look at the one or two not so good elements, and then we can tie this up. Alright, this book has not always aged well. The one thing in this specific book that we need to talk about are the foxes. Because they are clearly somewhat modeled on traveling people. The book uses the G slur. I'm not using it in here, but it is in there. And that is, you know, it's written in the 80s. Very few people thought about using that term as a slur back then. But it obviously is in there. And beyond that, what happens, I think, where things get somewhat difficult is that the fox being modeled on that also have all these negative anti-Sigonist stereotypes. What, you know, with being doing witch magic, being tricksy at the time, basically cheating everyone, grifting everyone, scamming everyone, betraying everyone, double dealing, being thieves, accidentally killing someone when we have a chicken hound, being wounded, being brought into the abbey, then betraying everyone. Those are unfortunately stereotypes that have been around for a long time when it comes to Sinti, Romani and other traveling people in Europe, and having those in there. The dangerous part is those work, right? Those stereotypes work. They are something that people have probably been used to for way too long, which means if you put them in, they grab your audience. It's very tempting to put them in, but that means you kind of propagate those. So the Fox storyline, I think, is something that has aged incredibly poorly in that regard, and I just, you know, I had to point it out. The way I think this is interesting, though, is beyond just, you know, being an old white man writing something old in the 80s when, you know, no one thought about it because it was the 80s and we were all on cocaine. The thing where I feel this is important is when we talk about dialect. I said this book is very British, and a lot of these animals do have different dialects and sort of like expressions of how to speak, with Basil Staghair having the whole like what and so forth, different English dialects. And those are obviously also part of, you know, what you might call class distinction. I feel in a way the Fox thing is tied into tapping into these different cliches and stereotypes of Britishness, which have, as I mentioned before, sort of been pounded in everyone who reads English literature because of, you know, having run a fucking empire for 2 centuries or so. That's something I wanted to bring up in that regard, because I feel it is sort of important to know that. There are good sides to this and there are bad sides to this, and the Fox plotline, I think, is one of those things that has unfortunately aged poorly. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's wrap this up. I think Redwall has aged mostly very well. I think it's a really good book to read to children or have children read. It does provide interesting lessons, some very positive lessons, some some even important lessons that are sort of outside of the scope of most children's books for that age. It does have a lot of action. It has like really, really cool characters. The way it is, the pacing works really well. It has the funny episodes. It does have the way it cuts to Clooney. That first opening chapter for Clooney the Rat is just incredibly good, incredibly well done. You can see why this is, you know, something that was turned into like a cartoon show, because yeah, you can see how those scenes cut really well, and having Clooney rise in on that horse cart is just like, wow, this is really good. One final thing that I found really interesting that I wanted to mention, because this is a children's book, is the riddles. There are songs and riddles in there, and there's lots of food in there. And one thing I noticed for the riddles is that those riddles obviously always get solved by it. It's clear, but the way it is written is usually the riddle is presented, and then people mull it over and talk about what it could be, and it slowly leads to the solution of the riddle. And I think this is important for a children's book, because it allows your the reader or the listener, if you read it to your children, to sort of puzzle those puzzles along and actually figure them out slightly before slightly before Matthias or Methuselah or anyone else figures it out. And I think that is that didactically, I think this is really well done. The way Brian Jacques does sort of build those riddles up, I did really, really appreciate that aspect of it. That's sort of all I have for Redwall, the first one. Tomorrow we'll be talking about Mattimeo, which is book 2 and follows, I presume, the son of Matthias the warrior and Cornflower Field Mouse. We'll see how that one goes. I am very much excited. I did not talk about the really, really cool darkness of Asmodeus the Snake, because I don't want to say Asmodeus too much because I lisp too badly, but having that sort of like dark like force of nature that even the rats and the evil, even the evil people are afraid of, I think is just really cool. So yeah, we have a dragon in this book. Isn't it awesome? Anyway, I hope you're having a great holiday season. I'll see you tomorrow for Mattimeo, and until then, thanks and happy Mousemas!